Hi, I'm Daniel Roberts, and you are listening to the Giving Town podcast, where we share stories of hope and generosity in our wonderful community of Newburgh, Oregon, and the surrounding area. This podcast is sponsored by my real estate team, the Joyful Roberts Group, and one of the main reasons I do this podcast is because I sincerely love this town, this community, and I love helping people move here. So if you know someone who wants to move here and needs help doing that, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'd be more than happy to help. So in today's episode, I'm talking to Olympian Carrie Bates as she shares her story. There were so many great things to cover that we had to turn this into a two-part episode. So this will be part one as Carrie shares her story of what it was like growing up in an alcoholic family, her journey to becoming an Olympian, and she also talks about many of the struggles with alcoholism and addiction in general. And then next week, we'll be covering part two. Carrie is such a wonderful woman and has a very powerful story, so I know you're going to enjoy this episode. Well, I have a special treat for you all today. I have Olympian Carrie Bates here, who is going to share her story, her past with addiction, her past as being an Olympian. And I heard the story previously when she came and spoke at our Rotary Club a little while back, and I mostly just want her to share her story today, but I'll be asking some questions in between. But you guys are in for a treat today. So thank you so much, Carrie, for joining me. I'm really excited to get your story out to all of our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always an honor for me to be able to sit down and share some of my journey and hopefully offer some insight and hope too when it comes to addiction and recovery. You know, my journey started many years ago. In 1984, I was at 16 years old. I was really blessed to win 3 Olympic gold medals in Los Angeles in the sport of swimming. And, you know, to the outside, it looked like I was living the perfect life, right? I was an accomplished athlete, going away to school on a full scholarship, and you know, really, my life was really just beginning to take off. But, you know, we were hiding a little secret in my house, which is that I was also growing up in an alcoholic home. And, you know, what I didn't realize then is what that really meant for my future. You know, I was a young kid. I didn't really understand addiction. And I didn't understand that I, too, potentially had the genetic predisposition to also suffer from this illness. And so, you know, the alcoholism in my house as a kid really, you know, posed a lot of challenges. But you know, I went away to school and I really didn't feel like I drank any differently than any of my peers. I've thought about that a lot actually in my sobriety to wonder, you know, there's always that question of when did you cross that proverbial line?
Yeah.
And I don't really know the answer to that for me. And I'm not sure it really matters because I ended up where I ended up no matter when I would have crossed that line. So, you know, I really went on with my life after the Olympics as a celebrated athlete. You know, I always say I was so blessed to be someone that really has gotten to see the world from a vantage point that very few people ever get to see. But I also, unfortunately, have seen the darkest parts of Earth. Yeah. And what it's like in this life to live in a really, really dark space. And, you know, but that's what brings me here today, right? Is that full circle moment where I can really use my platform as an Olympic champion to really start breaking down some of the stigma of addiction. In particular for women, there's a little more stigma, but, you know, so my journey has been a tough one.
Yeah. So share, as a child growing up in an alcoholic home, what was that like?
Yeah. You know, growing up in an alcoholic home is scary for kids. At least that's a word I would use from my experience. I was always afraid. I was always unsettled. I always felt unsure. And it made me really struggle with finding who I was because I really never had firm footing at home. I had one parent that was not an alcoholic, but that parent traveled all the time for business. So they weren't really there a lot. And then my other parent was the one that struggled with alcoholism so severely. You know, I remember leaving for swim practice at night, and I would beg my mom to not drink until I got home. And then I would beg, because that didn't work, and then I would beg to just maybe, can you just have like one before I got home? Mm-hmm. You know, I was really trying to negotiate with the disease, which is super interesting because as my own disease came on later in life, I did the same negotiations with my own disease that I used to do with my mom.
Yeah.
And not understanding that she was truly sick.
Yeah.
Like I thought my mother loved alcohol more than she loved me.
Which I think is a really important point that doesn't seem to get talked about. Even just that terminology of using disease. I can imagine some people are listening to it and say, well, it's not a disease. They're just, they're just addicts and, they can't, they don't have
morally
the willpower to
weak.
change it.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So can you, whether you want to elaborate now or down the road, I just think that's, I know some people are going to be thinking that, and it's an important thing to recognize that it's not, I think there are a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later.
Sure.
So yeah, continue. So you would negotiate with her.
So I would negotiate with her because I was afraid, because when I would come home from my practices at night, she would be intoxicated, and that left me feeling really lonely. Addiction is really isolating, and it's very, very lonely, even if you're living in a house with an alcoholic or a drug addict. It's very isolating, not just for the addict themselves, but for the family members that are in that family cycle, that family circle, dealing with the alcoholism or the addiction. Because really what happens is the addiction becomes the center point of the family, and then everything kind of revolves around that. The secrecy, no friends over.
Right.
We don't talk about it outside the house, which perpetuates the shame and the guilt and the stigma of it, right? And so that was very much present. All of those things were very much present for me as a child and into adulthood.
So then, progressing through childhood, you got to a point where, share how that kind of led to then your swimming career.
Yeah, for me, I was probably at a crossroads, which many kids get to when they're a child of an alcoholic or an addict. And that was, I could turn right and do whatever I felt like and do drugs and start drinking and doing all those things. Or I could really stick with this sport that I was starting to feel some success with. I was young. I happened to be pretty good at it, and I also loved it. That was really my family away from my home. And it's a place where I felt very safe. I felt loved. I felt successful. And it's really where I would go and work out all of my anger and my sadness and my fear. I've always said you couldn't see me cry underwater. Yeah. And I did a lot of that as a kid.
Do you feel like some of that pain drove your success to a degree?
I do. I do think that pain and that need to be successful, and that need to maybe make them proud of me. Yeah. All really, because that was the most positive part of my relationship with my mom, was my swimming, because she was very proud of me. My mom was a good mom. She was just a sick mom.
Yeah.
And so because of her own sickness, it was hard for her to get close to me in other ways, but she was super proud of my swimming accomplishments.
Do you feel like there is, maybe it's even hard to tell, but you mentioned just a minute ago, you felt like she loved alcohol more than you, and that part of your swimming was in an attempt to gain her love. Do you feel like there's a part of you that felt, if I'm successful enough at swimming, then maybe that would help her?
Sure. I definitely felt that growing up in the house with addiction,
not
understanding it, right? I didn't understand that it wasn't, love is not enough. It's just not enough to stop the cycle of this, of addiction, of the disease of addiction. This is what I call the great, equal opportunity destroyer. It literally will destroy every relationship and everything in its path. Yeah. Because there's only one real goal of addiction, and that's death, right? So anybody that stands in the way of that, or stands in the way of the progression, the disease silently takes that away from us to move us more and more into isolation.
What an insidious thing, too. Even describing it that way, there's one goal of death, which is death and love are very opposed. So love, that's
So I couldn't,
yeah.
she couldn't love me enough to stop drinking, just like I couldn't love it out of her to make her stop drinking.
Yeah.
It's just so much bigger than that. And then, later in life, I experienced that with my own family, my own children.
Yeah. So coming back to so you found swimming as being a great outlet. You were really good at it and continued to progress. So then what happened from there? So,
when I was 15 years old, my coach sat me down and said, you have a real chance of making the Olympic team next year. And I knew I was good, but I had dreamt of being an Olympian, my whole life. And I had all the posters in my rooms and all the things, and no different than any kid that aspires to a dream like that. And when he told me it was really a reality, that's when things got real, right? And where the training plans got real and the real goal. It wasn't a dream anymore. It went from a dream to a goal.
Yeah.
And there's a difference there. And so my whole life revolved around making that team. And once I made it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. I never thought I would win a gold medal, let alone 3 of them.
Yeah. So from there, then you went on to compete, and can you describe that experience of competing in those times that you experienced those wins?
Yeah. I swam the 100-meter freestyle, and it was the first event of the whole Olympics.
Oh, wow.
And we were another American and I, Nancy Hogshead, we tied for the gold in the 100-meter freestyle, and that was the first tie ever recorded in Olympic history. There has been some since then, but that was the first tie in Olympic history. Wow. So it was.
Do you remember the time?
55:92.
55. So they only went to the hundredths?
Only went to the hundredths, okay. Not the 1,000. So
I bet about that time they said, we need some more accurate equipment.
They still don't go down to the 1,000. Okay. So that hasn't changed. Okay. But it was the first time 2 swimmers were ever awarded a gold medal for the same event. So that was history making and so exciting. I was a young kid and we were whisked off to the Today Show and all these amazing things. It's just like what you would imagine it would be.
Yeah. And most people think of, wow, that's like the pinnacle of human experience. And once you do that, you've got it made. And, but that wasn't the end of the story. But how did it feel like when you got out of the water and found out that you got that time, or maybe it was later that you found out you'd actually gotten the gold medal?
Yeah.
How did you feel at that point?
Oh, gosh, how do you put that feeling into word? Elation. Yeah. I felt so proud to be an American, to stand on that award stand and watch, play the national anthem and sing it. And my whole family was in the stands. It was truly, at that point, it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to me.
Yeah.
I didn't know that it would become a blessing and a curse for me in my life until much later.
So what happened at that point? You won, you had all of the celebration, everything surrounding that. What happened from there?
Well, I went home, after the Olympics were over. We went on a tour of the United States, the medal winners and a guest, and that was really surreal. And then I went home and started high school again. I started my junior year in high school. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't easy going back and, navigating through who my real friends were and who wanted to spend time with me because I was, quote, famous. Yeah. And, so there was some of the beginnings of the other side of the coin that comes with being a public figure, being somebody that's in the media.
Yeah. And can you share that experience? Because a lot of young people, middle schoolers, high schoolers, and even college people have this idealization of being famous. They say if I could just be famous, I'd have it made. And you actually experienced high levels of fame, and maybe it wasn't all that was cracked up to be. So can you just kind of share some of what that was like, and maybe what you thought it was going to be, and then what it actually was?
Sure. I really embraced it at the beginning, but that was not something that when I would sit down and think about my goals and think about swimming and being an Olympic champion and all these things, being famous or what that meant was not part of that picture.
Right.
I didn't have illusions of money and fame and celebrity and all those things. I just wanted to be the best athlete in the world. And so
there's a bit of irony there too, right?
Right.
Like focusing on fame, you usually won't get it. Focusing on the goal sometimes. Anyway, just kind of a...
Yep, for sure. And so I was surprised at some of the things that came along with it. Like I had death threats, and people would call my house, and people called my high school and were threatening to kill me, and these types of things. And so you start to learn really quick the underside of being in the public eye.
And that's, I mean, most people would never even think to consider. I wouldn't even think to consider that an Olympian, just for being a fast swimmer, that you'd be getting death threats. I mean, why?
I mean, I guess I'll never know, but I think that there's sick people everywhere, right? And whether they did it for a joke or whether they did those things for attention or if they were ever really serious, I'll never know. Nothing ever happened. Nobody ever came to our home. Nobody ever stalked me at my school. So nothing ever really came from it. But it was the first, that was really the beginning of me. I'm kind of a introvert.
Okay.
And so having to be so extroverted all the time, I think...
Sounds exhausting.
I think what happened to me as I aged was that I learned really young how to be what everyone thought I was and not really be who I authentically was. And that's where, as I got older, I started to run into some trouble.
Wow. So through that, you navigated high school trying to figure out who are my friends, who are the people who just want to name drop.
Yeah.
And then what happened from there?
I went away to college. I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and we had an amazing swim program there and won multiple NC2A titles. And I had a wonderful, wonderful experience at the University of Texas. We kind of had a little bit of a mentality of we work hard and we play hard. So we worked real hard in the pool and outside of the pool. But we also played hard, And so I think that in 1988, so after my sophomore year in college, we had Olympic trials in Austin, and which was my home pool at that point. I was still ranked number 1 in the world. There was no reason I wouldn't have been on that Olympic team. And I showed up at Olympic trials and I just kind of mentally fell apart, and I did not make that Olympic team. And that was really after that whole Olympic trials, and they accumulated the team on the side of the pool and I was in the stands. That was the first time I realized that I had never really had a plan B. Like nobody had ever sat down with me and said, if you don't make it, it's okay. And this is what happens next in your life. And so that was the first time that I actually remembered drinking to not feel. Was after I didn't make the Olympic team in 88. As a matter of fact, I probably held on to that for 25, 30 years.
Wow.
That failure in my mind far and away exceeded the success I had had 4 years prior.
Wow. And so then what happened from there?
Well, I really didn't start, I met my husband and got married, and we had, we were living on the West Coast. We had 2 beautiful girls, and when the girls were quite little, is when I really drinking was a big part of our social life. So when we had our friends over, we were raising our kids with friends, drinking was always a normal part of what we did. And it's normal for many, many families. But I think that pilot light for me in my brain was always lit because of my genetic predisposition, that I was probably always destined to be an alcoholic.
Interesting.
So, as our lifestyle promoted more drinking, I was losing more and more control of my ability to control the drinking. Not just the quantity, but the frequency. We went from being the Friday, Saturday night drinking to then Thursday nights, or maybe somebody would come over for dinner on a Sunday night and we'd have some wine. So I was drinking more often, and then obviously the progression for me was also quantity. I was able to start drinking more. That's just all part of the progression.
Yeah. And was there a certain point where you noticed, wow, I think this is a problem? Or was it just kind of, it's just what you did and it was just like, no, it's just whatever?
Yeah, I had an incident when my kids were quite young. Let me back up and say, sure. I think that I knew prior to the incident I will tell you about, in my soul, I think I knew I had a problem, and people in my life were starting to express some concern about my drinking, which unbeknownst to me until, but of course now I know when that happens, that's when we really do need to start taking a serious look, because we're not the greatest self-assessors, because we're in it. And this is something that lives in the pleasure center of our brain. So because we feel good and because it brings us joy and we feel like this renewed energy and we feel prettier and more attractive and more social, there's that part of you that can't quite also say this is not good for me. Mm-hmm. So the voices of others is really important.
Yeah.
So people started to express some concern. My husband, my close friends were expressing concern for my drinking, and I definitely was in complete denial. I thought I still had control of this thing, that I was fine. And so one night we were at a party down the street, so we had just walked there, and the kids were home with a babysitter, and I walked home in a blackout and put the kids in the car and drove the babysitter home and got in an accident. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but it terrified me. But it wasn't enough to get me sober. And that's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand, is that when these incidents happen for us, everyone thinks, well, this surely will be the thing that makes them stop drinking.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case. Some of us, our bottoms are higher, mm-hmm. and some of us, our bottoms are lower.
Yeah.
And some of us, our bottoms are death, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the ultimate bottom when it comes to addiction.
Yeah.
So the question is, where can we meet people at their bottom? Can we help raise their bottom to them so they don't have to keep going into the darkness?
Yeah.
Because there is, as long as we keep digging, the bottom gets lower.
Yeah. I'm kind of surprised I'm sharing this, but I think just the shame surrounding addiction and the way it works. When I was in middle school and high school, I had a pornography addiction, mm-hmm. and it's different, mm-hmm. but it's very similar. And you're
sure.
like, what am I doing? Like, this is terrible. Like, I totally against everything I believe in, but nothing was enough to make it stop. As many times as I would tell myself, like, I hated myself. You're never gonna do this again. Like all the things. It was all rooted in shame, and it was never enough. And like you say, in that time, like, you recognize this is wrong. Like, this is totally a problem, but it wasn't enough to change. And I think, we all experience addictions on some level, whether mm-hmm. it's alcoholism, whether it's drugs, whether it's food, whether it's pornography, whether it's whatever it is. Some are just more publicly damaging, and some have a more widespread noticeable effect. But mm-hmm. I think the important thing to recognize is that the hating yourself, the shaming yourself, all of that fuels it. I feel like maybe it feels like for a time, mm-hmm. you can maybe by sheer willpower change. Did you experience like all those same thoughts of?
Mm-hmm. Shame is what nearly killed me. I went to 4 residential treatment programs in 2 years. I was away a lot, and I felt like a failure because I couldn't get it. Like, I'd go to treatment, I would do okay for a little while, and then I'd be back drinking. And my relationships, I went through a divorce from my kid's dad. And, by the time I checked into my last treatment center in February of 2012, I was really just a shell of the person that I once was. I was really soulless. My soul was very, very sick. And, I almost died. And I wasn't so sure I didn't want to die. And so I detoxed at home alone, which is incredibly dangerous. Alcohol withdrawal is the only withdrawal you can die from. And I made a promise to myself that night when I said I'm done. is that if I survived detox at home alone, that I would try one more time and go to treatment. And 5 days later, I kind of came out of it, and I got on a plane and I went to treatment for, what I hoped to be my last time in 2012. And I stayed for 90 days, and it was the greatest gift that I ever received. Willpower really has nothing to do with this. The primary reason that people don't get help, less than 10% of people that struggle with addiction ever receive help. The primary reason for that is not financial, it's shame. Because, I was so wrapped up in being what everyone thought I was or what I should be, that and all along I was dying on the inside.
Yeah.
And so, I was lucky I survived it. Many of us don't. But, treatment really, staying that long and getting the help that I needed, both mental health and substance use, co-occurring type of treatment, is really what helped me get into the starting blocks of life as a sober woman. And it also gave me the tools to continue and sustain recovery. It's not just about getting sober. It's about how to find sustained recovery. That's our challenge.
Yeah. I mean, because you can go, I don't even know what the average length of time is between relapses, but if you think, oh, I'm good now, I'm sure that's probably a really dangerous point of when you...
Very dangerous.
Yeah. And...
there's a saying that what you put in front of your recovery, you will lose. And I proved that point by the end of my drinking. Everything that I put in front of my recovery. I can't go to a meeting tonight. I have the girls. The girls have soccer practice. I need to get my work done. All those things that slowly started to take over the top of the list, I lost every single one of them when I returned to drinking. I lost my career. I lost all my friendships. I lost my marriage. And ultimately, I lost my children. I had to walk into a courtroom at 95 days sober and have a judge tell me that if all I had to do was stay sober for 2 years and I could have legal rights back to my kids. And the reason I had my kids not removed, we were separated, so my ex-husband took full custody. But the reason that the judge agreed to that was not because I'd ever done anything terrible to them or with them, but because I tried to get sober too many times.
Which is that sucks. Has that changed at all in the way the justice system works? That just seems so backwards. Or is it still that way? I think
that the justice system could do a much better job at if you look, this opens a whole new can of worms when we start talking about this, but if you look at the overcrowding jails and prison systems and how many people are in there for drug offenses that really need treatment and are getting nothing in jail, and the taxpayer, this is a whole nother rabbit hole, but something needs to be done. There needs to be better access to treatment. Oregon sits at number 3 in the country for the rate of addiction in our state, and we rank 50th with regards to access to treatment.
Wow. Elise Yona Holloman was sharing in a previous episode about just I think we're also ranked 50th in terms of mental health access. So both mental health access and treatment access, that's a pretty terrible combination.
And as you see the condition of what's happening in Portland, you can see the devastation by not having the resources that people really need. I was blessed because I had family that had resources to get me the help that I needed.
Yeah.
Not everyone is as privileged as I was to have access to the things that I had access to.
Yeah. So share, being a mom, you ultimately had to make a choice that you had a good idea. You either continue down the path of alcoholism, try to make things work with your family, or go to treatment knowing that you may lose your family. Did you know that was a choice you were making?
I knew if I drank again that I would lose my kids. And I drank again.
Yeah.
I knew, but that's the power of the disease. That's not my moral failing. Because, alcoholics and addicts, are usually not bad people, but we do bad things when we're under the influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of judgment and stigma attached to when people run into situations like I did with losing my kids. And, you start racking up things in the loss column.
Yeah.
And people say, what the heck's wrong with her? Yeah. Why can't she just stop drinking?
Yeah.
Right? Instead of understanding the sickness and the disease, and that my mind and brain was completely hijacked by the chemicals. People say, I can't tell you how many days I woke up and said, I will not drink tonight. I am convicted. I'm not drinking. And then by 4:00, right, you start getting the itch. And that's actual real, like, brain chemistry stuff, because your serotonin level dips. All the things start happening,
mm-hmm.
and then you end up drinking again.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the tools to know how not to, by getting help, the cycle never ends.
So what are some of those, and I don't know if there's still more to share on that, or if you want to move into like some of the tools that do exist and like the treatment, is there more to share? I don't want to jump too far ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, and we can talk about the tools. One of the things I want to communicate most today is hope.
Yeah.
As sad as our stories can be, and as heartbreaking as our stories can be, there's also a lot of hope. And there's, I personally feel that this was all meant to happen in our life. And I say ours because my kids are involved too. And, I also believe that our greatest opportunities for growth and greatness come from our darkest times.
Yeah.
It took me 2 years to be able to actually brush my teeth and look at myself in the mirror.
After being sober.
Correct.
For 2 years.
I wanted to I only wanted to be visible to my kids because I was so ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And then at 4 years is when I first went public with my recovery, because I finally made a decision that I hid in my addiction. I'm not going to hide and be ashamed of being a woman in recovery.
Yeah.
And that's the day that I chose to start Recovering Out Loud, and to use my platform to start chipping away at stigma, and also to give people some hope.
Do you feel like when you did that, I'm sure that was a terrifying decision.
Terrifying.
There was at one point where was it a social media?
It was.
And so you did that. What was going through your mind as you hit that post
button? It took me a while to hit the post button. The picture was a picture of my Olympic gold medal next to my AA coin. And I think I said something to the effect of, the Olympic gold medal is what I did, and the AA coin resembles who I am. And I went on to talk some more, and it took me a long time to hit post because I was really afraid of the negative comments and the stigma.
What were some specific fears? Like, what were the things you were afraid of people were going to say?
I was afraid for my kids, that they would get backlash from their friends or their friends' parents. So of course I talked to them before I ever posted it, and they were very encouraging of me to do it. And they have remained encouraging of me to be public about my recovery ever since then. They're public about it too, as adults. I think I was afraid that people would say those stigmatizing things. Like, I was called everything, okay? Like, when I was drinking, I was called a horrible mother, a terrible woman. Your kids would be better if you just disappeared. Wow. These types of things. And I was afraid of those kind of comments. Yeah. But the pride I felt as a recovering woman finally outweighed the fear of being judged. And that's when I was able to hit that post button.
So what was the ultimate response?
It was like unreal positive. Not one negative comment, not one. I post every year on my birthday, my sobriety day. Wow. And it's the most engagement I ever receive on social media is on that day. Love, support, encouragement. That first post, people were shocked. People that don't live by me anymore. I'm part of a global community on Facebook because of my swimming.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just, so people in my community knew, because, you know, my fall from grace was not exactly private.
Yeah.
And so it shocked a lot of people. But I think people are so starved for somebody to talk about it, because I don't think I know one person that doesn't know somebody.
Yeah. Do you feel, because when someone's an Olympian, or they compete at a certain level and experience a lot of success, that in many ways can become their identity. And then once that's gone, especially if they've grown up in an alcoholic household, and sometimes maybe not, but when they've lost their identity, can that be a trigger?
Sure.
Or did you find that when you came public with that other people, that whether they'd been a pro athlete or an Olympian themselves, that also came out and said, wow, thank you so much, because I also experienced that? Did you experience any of that?
Very much.
Okay.
I still get messages from people that, you know, reach out to say, like, I'm struggling, and they ask for help.
Yeah.
And it's my greatest pleasure and joy to be able to help somebody else.
Yeah.
Even just to be an ear. Like, I don't need to make any recommendations, but I can tell them, like, I understand absolutely everything that you're going through, because I was there.
Yeah.
I lived exactly in your shoes, you know? And that, it's powerful in addiction to know that you're not alone, because you do feel alone.
Yeah. You know, growing up with a mother who was an alcoholic, and also being one yourself, if you could go back and have a conversation with your mom, like if you could go back, basically be in that room with her while she was drinking, what would you say? Have you ever thought of that, or is that... Sorry, I just kind of sprung that on you.
No, it's a really, really, really good question. I think I know for sure I would have a lot more empathy. I know for sure I would talk to her much kinder than I did. I know that I would have told her I loved her no matter what. I would have done my best to understand, as a 16-year-old child and younger, what she was going through, if I understood the disease. And see, that's one of the calls to action, is that if you have someone in your life, a grandmother, a grandfather, a parent, a sibling, that has struggled with substance use disorder or any mental health disorders, we owe that to the future generation, to talk to them about it. Because I didn't understand the hereditary nature of addiction until I suffered myself. And so I think that if I had understood it more, or it had been part of our conversation at home, but we didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
There was too much shame back then, and especially for women. I mean, women didn't get help back then. You're talking about the early 80s. You know, women weren't even part of studies about addiction, about the brain and all these things. It was all men. So my mother never got the help she needed, because it was easier to just close the front doors, and we just don't talk about it. Yeah. You know? I've made what I like to say a living amends to my mom by making my apologies to her after she was gone, because I didn't get sober until after she passed. And I hope part of my living amends to my mom is that I've stopped the cycle in our family. I pray that for my girls, that they don't suffer.
You know, and you mentioned you felt like you were essentially destined to become that. No matter what, you would have been an alcoholic. Given the fact that it was your mom within you, and now the next generation is kind of at the point where it's like, okay, here's where we need to make sure this stops. What hope do you have that it will stop, and that given their genetic predisposition, that they'll be able to overcome it?
And it wasn't just my mom and I mean, there's like generations of our family that have struggled. My hope is that I've shown the girls a different way to live. My hope is that they have a full understanding of what's running through their veins, and that awareness is key. I, of course, never want to have to see my kids struggle the way I struggled, but I also have to allow my children the grace of living their own story.
Yeah.
And I can't make my story theirs. They're writing their own script, and I can wish and pray that it doesn't happen to them, but it's not enough. As we talked about, love, all of it's not enough. So my hope is awareness, that they've been exposed to my recovery now for 11 years, and that they understand what the genetic predisposition is to them as well.
Yeah. Will
hopefully play a role as they get older, because for women, especially with alcohol, typically happens a little later in our life, and it happens pretty fast. So that's my hope for them.
Yeah. And do you feel, we mentioned just a little bit ago, that addiction takes many forms, whether it's alcoholism, whether it could be anything. Do you feel like there's a similar, like the addiction part, whether it's alcohol or anything else, do you feel like there's a similarity there? Obviously you experienced alcoholism, which is...
Oh yeah, I mean, it all lives in the same part of the brain, right? It affects our pleasure center, and that's your decision making. All of that is affected by any kind of addiction, even shopping or gambling or drugs and alcohol, food. You know, if you go into Barnes and Noble and you look for the addiction aisle, and there's far more books on food than there is on substances. So it's about control, the illusion of control, and then the cat and mouse game of the feel good to not feel good to then feel good because you don't want to feel bad, right? And so you get on that hamster wheel.
Yeah.
With anything that's addictive.
Well, that is the end of part 1, and I'm so sorry to do that to you, but we'll be coming out with part 2 next week. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to the Giving Town podcast, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend who you think might benefit from hearing it. And while more and more people are continuing to hear about this podcast, I really need your help to spread the message about all the people and organizations that make Newburgh so great. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Can you share some of the work? I know we've talked a lot about the story